Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this GIRI forum. This is the third in a series of 3 spring-come-summer forums, which are dedicated to thought-provoking ideas about getting it right in design. This is an interactive session, so please get ready to contribute with your thoughts and comments. And I'm pleased today to be joined by Nick Francis, who is Education Director at GTC, the GIRI training arm, and Oliver Broadbent of Constructivist. I'm going to give a short introduction about GIRI for those of you who are less familiar with us, and then hand over to Nick to lead the session. On the how to keep in front, can I ask you to mute your microphones if you're not speaking, but remember to turn back on in the breakout sessions and if invited to ask or answer a question. If you don't mind leaving on your video, that helps because it gives the meeting more vitality. And if any questions come to mind as we go through, which are not within one of the breakout sessions, then please use the chat box and Nick will try and pick them up during the discussions. We'll keep a record of the chat and seek to answer any outstanding queries after the event. This event is being recorded and will be available on YouTube afterwards. If you have any tech problems, please adopt the usual IT support tactic, turn off and try again. Leave the meeting and rejoin using the same link. So, as I said, this is the third and final in our series of webinars looking at the subject of good design, all of which will be available to view on the GIRI channel. The first webinar was largely focused on the GIRI philosophy of changing culture and behaviours to avoid error in design. Subsequently, we took a broader look at the meaning of good design, and now we are directing our attention forward to consider the global long-term context of design and how we might continue to improve what we do. GIRI itself was set up in 2016 following some research into the cost of error. We were particularly interested in the impact on productivity, and so we were looking at cost. We had the direct cost at 5%. This is what is identified on sites through NCRs and tablets and the like. Then you've got indirect cost at 7%. This is the delays and disruption that occur to others when error occurs. Unrecorded process waste is where waste occurs, but it's not recorded and you have errors happening and they're hidden, or we don't get the reports through, 6%. And then of course latent defects, which unfortunately in the industry are fairly prevalent at 3%. Now these figures might be a bit higher or lower, but they're the right order of magnitude. And if we think that the construction industry turns over just in excess of 100 billion a year, we're wasting 21 billion pounds. And what could we do with that? We could have a lot better things to spend that on. So it's a bit of a no-brainer. We need to do something about it. So we were established originally to improve construction productivity, but the world's changing and boardrooms are now recognising the broader range of imperatives that need to be satisfied, covering safety, sustainability and quality. And it's what we're showing is that an error-free strategy provides a platform for achieving all these objectives, and our strategic aim now reflects this. Back in 2018, a group of GIRI members, clients, contractors, consultants and the supply chain collaborated in the creation of the GIRI Design Guide. The guide is applicable to any project, particularly at its commencement and during early design stages, and aims to share knowledge across the industry as a useful tool rather than presenting itself as a groundbreaking report, and serve as a reminder of the best practice techniques to follow when approaching projects. Following its original launch, we had a survey a couple of years ago, and we launched a re-edit last November, and it's been endorsed by the ICE, the RICS and the iStruct, and we expect others to follow. A video supporting the use of the guide with senior representatives from major clients and the former presidents of RIBA and ICE was made to accompany the launch. So we're basically looking at getting the right culture in the industry so that people feel empowered to act in ways which reduce error to the benefit of all those in the industry and those who live and work in the building and infrastructure we create. I'm now going to hand over to Nick, and he's going to lead our webinar. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you very much, Cliff. Hello, everybody. As Cliff said, if you're able to turn your cameras on, please do, and give a little wave. It just makes me feel slightly more sane that I'm not just sitting here talking to my laptop. If you are able to find the chat box, it would be really useful if you could just put in there maybe your name and either who you work for or what you do, so that we just get a flavour for the mix of who is on the call today. So just do that in the background. Just say what you do or who you work for, and we'll get that idea of who's on the call, so where we're drawing experience from. Okay, so an outline of what we're doing today. I will attempt to share my screen, see if this works. There we go. So what we're going to look at today is we're going to explore what is the limit of our responsibility as designers in the built environment. We'll have a short little presentation exploring what is it to go from being sustainable to being regenerative. We'll then have a group discussion to identify what we do now. We'll then have the second part of our presentation where we introduce to this idea of the second site. So we'll see what that is. And then in some breakout groups, we'll ask you to explore what is your second site? What is that for you? And then at the end, we'll wrap up and see what we can learn. Now, we're very fortunate today to be joined by Oliver Broadbent. Now, Ollie, he was the director of ThinkUp, so an education consultancy, and was instrumental in setting up all of the GIRI training that hopefully some of you are familiar with. He's also in the final throes of writing a book called The Regenerative Structural Engineer, which is going to be published by the Institution of Structural Engineers this autumn. And he is an 1851 fellow in regenerative design. So that means he's working on a 2-year program to try and mainstream these concepts of regenerative thinking. And he's currently recruiting volunteers to participate in a policy lab. So basically a working group to explore these in more detail. So if you're interested, please do get in touch with Ollie at the end. So just to set the scene, is this topic relevant in terms of being regenerative? Well, I just wanted to highlight a few recent news articles that seemed relevant. Some of you are probably aware of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, a new law passed in Wales, and that has changed all of their regulations around road building. So very real impacts for the construction industry. Many of you are probably aware of the ongoing legal disputes about Heathrow, about whether or not they're able to expand. You may have seen this project. This is an example from New York, the High Line. So a project to regenerate and transform old infrastructure, bringing green into the heart of the city. And also a lot of the massive projects that are going on around the UK are things that we maybe wouldn't have thought about 10 or 20 years ago. So this is an image from the Sophia wind farm project up in the northeast that some of you may or may not be working on. So that leads us on to our first question, which is that construction projects mean different things to different people. But what I'd like to ask all of you is, as a project team, what is the spatial limit of our responsibility? So, what is the physical limit to how much is our responsibility? Is it the site? Is it the local neighborhood? Or is it something else? So I will stop sharing my screen. And can I ask you all, please, to go back into the chat box, and we'll have a fastest fingers first competition, and maybe just throw in some suggestions as to what do you think is the limit of our responsibility as a project team for what is the physical boundary of the site that we should be thinking about? See who gets it. The extent of the brief. Okay, Steve, thank you. Could you just comment on that? How is that explained by the brief? maybe ask Steve if you're able to unmute and just talk about how
it depends on what you're looking at. If you're looking at a scheme that might be a catalyst for the urban regeneration of a whole area with numerous stakeholders, then the brief is going to cover a vast gamut of different assets and different the creation of different assets, the creation of whole zones, really just think outside the standard boundary of a defined asset owner's remit.
okay.
And so how long is a piece of string? It all depends on what the brief says.
Okay, interesting. But you're definitely identifying the brief as a key document there. Ruth, can I ask you to expand? You've said anything downstream. Can I just ask you to explain or expand on that, please?
Hi, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we
Yes,
can.
brilliant.
I
Okay,
can hear you. That's great.
that's great. Just get my camera back on. So it's really, I mean, as a, you know, the work we do at Homes England, it's affecting wider society. So it's getting local people involved, community engagement, all of that. So it's beyond the actual site, which probably hasn't got anybody living on it necessarily. But it's also kind of wider downstream stuff. So if we don't want to be creating pollution, we don't want things to kind of be running off our site. We want to be looking at minimizing carbon, minimizing greenhouse gases. So it's kind of affecting a lot more than just the site or even the areas next to it.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. And that leads us nicely on to my next question. So I'll just pop this up on the screen, which is we looked at the physical boundary and had a few different answers for that. What about time? What is the time limit of our responsibility as a project team? Is it to cutting the ribbon? Is it to the end of the retention period? Is it the design life? Or is there something else? So I'll just let you type your answers in the box and see what you think. Are we able to define our responsibility in terms of time if we're part of a project team? Yeah, see, lots of concentration, lots of fast moving fingers there. I don't get any thought. We talk about retentions, don't we? They're normally 12 years, typically. What is a project team's responsibility? Duration of their responsibility. Design life, Ray. Okay, interesting. So Ray is saying design life because as designers, we need to comply with the brief, but must consider the wider impact of our designs. Okay, great. Anyone anything either agree with that? I mean, thumbs up if you agree with Ray, or anyone think anything different? Dependent on the stakeholders. Okay, so Steve again with stakeholders, 120 years for a bridge. Depends on the project, construction period, long-term stewardship of what we're creating, directly our contractual requirements, but indirectly the end of life information. Okay, great. Well, what I will do now is maybe I'll hand over to you, Ollie. So I've stopped sharing, I think. So I'll hand over to you and we'll hear from you, Ollie. So
Great, thank you. Can you hear me, Nick?
I can.
That's good news. Thank you, Cliff, and thank you, Nick, for that introduction. And can I just say, before I start, I mean, this is really a privilege to be speaking with this community that I was quite heavily involved with a few years ago, and helping to think about actually how do we train people in reducing error. And this is about actually, I think there's a really great crossover here, which is, this is not on the slides, but this is riffing on just what I've just said, and then I'll go to the slides in just a sec. But there's a difference between what we intend to do and what the outcome is. In one of the GIRI training videos, I think it's one of the speakers says, nobody comes to work to cause error. Nobody wants to do that, but we end up with error. We end up with error that costs something like 21% of the annual turnover of the construction industry. So we know that. I think when we're starting to think about this stuff, about our impact, nobody aims to come to work to cause a negative impact. So this is not about finger pointing about income, but is about thinking about
the overall outcome of our work. So with that in mind, I'm going to adventurously try and share my slides. This worked during the tech check. Hopefully it's going to be working now. Let's see. Nick, can you give us a thumbs up if that's working? Great. Okay, so introduction to regenerative design. I should say this is actually a very large topic, and I'm only going to give you a sort of snippet of it, hopefully a teaser, hopefully to help you get into this space. I think what we need to do is rewind and actually talk about the word sustainability. So sustainability has really, for about 25 years now, laid the groundwork for thinking in our industry more widely about how we balance the social, the environmental, and the economic prosperity. We talk about you've probably heard the triple bottom line as an expression. It's got people to start to think about, okay, what is the wider impacts of our work? And it has successfully brought environmental issues into mainstream consciousness and into our work. And I think a big celebration of that is probably think back to 2012, when that's probably one of the most sustainable Olympic Games ever delivered in the world. It's still a benchmark for that. And that was because of a really honest, clear, upfront sustainability strategy developed from the client side right the way at the beginning. However, there's a kind of problem with sustainability, which is that if we think about the definition of sustainability, which goes along the lines of basically meeting our needs without compromising the needs of the next generation. If that is our aim, and we recognize that no project is 100% sustainable, if that is our aim, then what the best that we can do is cause no harm. But most projects don't achieve sustainability. And so what that means is that every project in some way is still causing harm. And that is, I come back to that question of intent versus outcome. We don't want that to be the case, but actually overall, the net impact is that our work as an industry is causing harm. And that is reflected in the climate emergency declarations that many firms that you might be involved with have signed up to. It's reflected in global emissions, it's affected by the biodiversity crisis. And what we find is construction makes something like 40 to 50% contribution to the carbon crisis. And we don't even fully know the impact that we have on the actual living world, on nature, through the work that we do. So this is really a kind of what people I think in industry are starting to get interested in, is how do we tackle this? It's a big question. And that's hopefully what I can give you some clues as to the angle that we're going at with this. So imagine what if we try to do better than doing no harm? And that is what regenerative design is starting to get us to think about. Imagine what if every time we built something, it didn't just make that place better, but it made all of the places that were impacted by the supply chain. It made all to think the next questions at the start, all the places in future and past that we touch through that construction process. What if it actually encouraged and made those places better as well? So that actually we're not aiming just to do no harm, but every time we set around building a building, the whole gamut of factors actually is enhanced. What would that look like? So the last year or so, I've been leading a group of people through a process that we call the Regenerative Design Lab, leading thinkers from industry, getting together to actually think about how to turn this into practice. And we've got a definition which we're working with, and it goes as follows, which says that the aim of regenerative design is for human and living systems to survive, thrive, and co-evolve. The aim of regenerative design is for living systems to survive, thrive, and co-evolve. Now, that's a sentence that may be relatively easy to say, especially if you've been practicing saying it like I have. But actually, what's embedded in that is a really fundamental shift to thinking about when we build stuff, do we want everything that we're touching to be better, or do we actually want to leave parts of the world depleted? That's a really fundamental question which we need to get into. But before we get into some details of that, I'm going to hand back to Nick, who's going to lead us through another discussion. I'm just going to stop my screen share there.
Great, thanks, Ollie. So I will just share a question, and this will be another fastest fingers first question. So if you can get ready to type, what my question is what are the current positive outcomes from construction. So typical projects that we work on, what do we think are typically the positive outcomes? What is it that we're doing that is generally of benefit? So I'll just let you stick those answers in the box. So what are the typical positive outcomes from construction projects that we work on day to day? Resolving a problem. Yeah, Ray, you've got resolving a problem, better working environment. So Carl, can you talk about that working environment? What do you mean? What's included in that?
Hi, yeah, sorry, I was
Hi.
late to the
That's all right.
party. Yeah, I think, you know, I'm in the designing field with Atkins, so I haven't introduced myself if there was a round of introductions. But everything we do, we try and look after the individuals. So potentially we want to get them to work for that mixing and that social interaction. I appreciate we've gone through a very dormant time with offices. Just looking around here, you can see many many home artifacts. So it's but everything that we design, we think for the benefit of the individual, the group, open spaces, closed spaces. So, all right, very stereotypical, I suspect. But from my point of view, I'm a building services engineer, so I don't care about how we sit, how we type something. It's more the environment. Is that individual, should we say, not sweating at his desk?
Great.
Bring it down to that.
So it sounds a bit like there are, every project is done for a reason. That's normally involve a human being somewhere, and you've got those key stakeholders, and you are making something better for that person generally.
Yes.
Otherwise, you're probably not going to be doing the project. Okay, great, thank you. So the next question then is sort of the opposite of that. Is what are the current negative outcomes of construction? So we've identified that most projects have a positive outcome, but what are typically the negative outcomes, do you think? It's those sort of unintended consequences, as Ollie was talking about them. Okay, so we've got poor quality from Ian. Yeah, price work, meaning that we don't end up with that quality environment that we maybe wanted. Use of resources. Okay, so presuming that's resources that can't be used again. We're using them up. We're digging into our pot.
Exactly. There's always that key word, isn't it? Offset. Whatever you use, can you offset it with something else?
Okay, interesting. Disruption to local communities. That's an interesting one. Okay, yeah. Vast amounts of natural resources and creating vast amounts of carbon emissions. Okay, Vicky, do you want to sort of just comment on that? Obviously quite a strong,
that's a key
feeling on that.
Hi. Yeah,
Hello.
I mean, the whole of the industry needs to really think about the resources that we're using, and particularly those high embodied carbon emissions within the sort of concrete and steel that we consistently use. And we need to start thinking about how we actually can optimize that sort of circular economy of utilizing resource till the nth degree and minimizing the reprocessing and constantly extracting natural resources.
Interesting. Okay, thanks. Anyone want to comment on what Vicky said there, particularly noticing our very high consumption of steel and concrete? Anyone recognize that from their own work? I know when I look out of my window, I can definitely see it. Looking across the Sheffield skyline, I can see a lot of new steel and concrete.
So, I mean, getting down into the detail. Sorry, I'm sort of hogging everybody else's thoughts, but getting down into the detail up front from a designer's perspective, you get the structural engineers and the architects trying to drive down, dare I say it, some buzzwords, rhetoric, decarbonisation. So they're doing everything they physically can to say, get a thinner piece of concrete, get less steel within the concrete, but the same level of resilience. But thereafter, it's all let down at times because of, dare I say, suppliers, the providers of stuff, because a lot of their, should we say, their stuff has been tested, for argument's sake, for example, fire products are all being tested against standard slab sizes, standard whatever, and they're still behind the curve from a point of view of the innovation of decarbonisation. And it's
interesting.
It's
Yeah, so
you mentioned cradle to grave, which is fantastic, and it's that supplier end. I think we can all have the best design in, but the providers of the equipment and the installers can really let that particular element down at times.
okay, so sometimes even if people, you know, particular members of the project team are doing their utmost, it still can fall down for wider reasons. Okay, thank you. There's some good comments in the chat, so I encourage you to look at those, please. But what I'll do is I'll pass back to you, Ollie, and I'll let you carry on.
Thanks, Nick, and thank you everyone for those comments. Very interesting. Let me just see if I can build on that. Now, I just, as I say, this is a very short amount of time, so it's just a taster. But I think there's something that's really interesting that we can delve into, so we can actually really try and understand our impacts, but also our opportunities, because we are trying to create opportunities in all the work that we're doing. So I'm just going to share my screen one more time. The second part is called the second site, and I'll explain why in just a moment. We're thinking more and more in our industry about carbon, and we are making actually some interesting, good strides and interesting developments on how to develop that. And I'm involved with delivering the net zero structural design training at the Institution of Structural Engineers. But the challenge with focusing on carbon is that actually it's only one piece of the pie. There's only one bit that we are, it is something that we could put a number to very easily, but we are seeing that there could potentially be unintended consequences of focusing solely on carbon. So what about our impact on things like communities? What about the communities that we're building in, but the communities where resources come from? What about water? What about, is water overall left more polluted as a result of our project, or is it actually water quality enhanced? Something which we're thinking more and more about actually is soil health, because actually we're seeing a net decrease in soil health, and what does that could have unintended consequences on our food supplies later on, which it might be too late for us to figure out later on. And of course, I saw somebody write BNG in the chat, which stands for biodiversity net gain. That means overall, are all the insects which are actually out there pollinating our food supplies and everything, actually, are we seeing a decrease or an increase in them? And I don't have the exact statistics, but we've lost something like a third of the insects in the UK in a very short space of time. That's actually quite scary. That's the stuff of kind of sci-fi scary stuff, but that is important to recognize. And then of course the impact on the local economy, the economies where we're building, the economies where our materials come from. So there's lots and lots of factors there. And there's just one thing. Now this comes from the co-author in the book, James Norman, who I'm writing this book on regenerative design with. One of his favorite projects, it's a work by an artist called Thomas Thwaites. It's called the Toaster Project. And he said, I am going to try and build a toaster from first principles. I'm going to try and source all of the materials myself to build a standard toaster, which involved him traveling around the world, finding all the materials, finding out where he could get the plastic pressed, finding out where he'd get the rare earth metals to build the fuse that goes in the plug. And this was a year-long project, and he just about able to build a toaster. So in a sense, the rest of the world is part of his construction site, even though he's assembling it on his workbench. And it's what's the interesting thing about Thomas Thwaites' work is actually trying to figure out what is the second site? What is the rest of the construction site that I don't really know about? I'm reliant on it, but I don't really know about it. So you might have a diagram of your site with a thick red line about it, whereas that's the project boundary and we don't think about it. But what's interesting to think about is, what is the true impact? If I also considered all the places my materials came from, we might imagine a much larger site. And I go back to my thing earlier on about intent versus outcome. We might not intend for there to be any problems there. We might even not think about it, but actually the net outcome of our industry is to cause harm on that second site. So we can start to think about, we can start to ask questions to try and figure out where that site is. A bit like the Toaster project, but how are we going to do that for a building, for a whole estate, for a whole city? And so we might start to ask questions like, what happens at the place of origin of all these materials? Where does the gypsum come from that goes into the cement, that goes into the concrete, that goes into the foundations? Where does the steel come from? Where does the iron ore come from, which goes into the steel? And we keep chasing these things back. And then we can start to ask, when we're taking things from a place, what is the impact in that place? What is the rate of renewal of the resources? If they're renewable, if it's timber, how long does it take to regrow? If you're destroying a landscape, how long does it take for that landscape to recover? And what might be untapped resources? You know, we might be, I was speaking to somebody just half an hour ago who has been working on a project where in Basildon, he's just got hold of a warehouse full of cross-laminated timber that was just going spare from another project, was about to be chipped and pulped and burnt. And he's managed to recover that, and that's now being brought to London to be brought into a different project. Sometimes we need to look around to see what are the resources that are not yet being used that we could use in a way that is sustainable. And of course, it's not just the the sites that we're affecting, but the whole logistic chain that comes along the way, the yards where all these materials are stored and places along the way. And then of course, it's not just up to construction and opening the project, but what about our waste? What happens downstream? What unintended consequences might we be created there? And also what opportunities might there be? And I guess the last one I'll say before handing back is, what about the relationships with those suppliers? If we went and spoke to the suppliers and find out where things were coming from, you might be able to find out more of what they've got more of. Is there a better way that they could be sourcing it? Because they're starting to think about this stuff. We're working with suppliers at the moment, and they're starting to think about how can we reduce the impact of our work. So they want to talk about it. You want to talk about it. You could have a conversation and see what you could unlock. I think that's it from me for now, Nick. Handing back to you.
Great. Thanks, Ollie. Okay, so that's really interesting, isn't it? And it's sort of intuitive to start with that, oh, well, our stuff comes from somewhere. You know, the impact of our site isn't just on the site. But as you start to unpackage it, it's quite eye-opening to think just how diverse that is and how far that reach goes. I love that that toaster. I quite fancy the idea of doing that myself. So what we're going to do now is to put you into breakout groups. So it should be about probably six people in breakout group. And what I'd like you to do, please, is to just try and answer these questions. So for the projects that you work on, can you just start to identify what is the second site? So what are the areas that maybe are outside the red line of your site, but you think are really relevant, that you are having some impact on? Then from that, say, what is it that's invisible to you? So when you start thinking about that, what bits on your site you go, do you know what? I just have no idea where that comes from. What are the things that you just don't know about that you maybe haven't noticed before? And then the final question is, well, so what? What does that mean? What does it matter, basically? So if you can, in your groups, please answer those three questions. What do you think counts as your second site? What is it that's invisible to you? Yeah, Ollie?
And just to say, we've put in there this example of the 5 wheres. So in any of you familiar with the GIRI training, you know we asked the 5 whys. Why did that happen? And why did that happen? And then why did that happen? So you get to root cause. Well, maybe ask the 5 wheres. Where does something come from? And where does that thing come from? And where does that thing come from? And do we come to some, not root cause, but root origin, to coin a phrase live here on the GIRI webinar?
Cool, thanks, Ollie. Yeah. Yes, so if you can, please try and answer those 2 questions. What we will ask as well is if you nominate one person from within your group who is going to be your typer and spokesperson, so that when we come back together afterwards, that person can just type some comments in the box and we'll come around and hear from each of the groups. So I'll ask Helena now, please, to put you into those groups. And if you can try and answer, what is your second sight? What's invisible to you? And so what? And we'll open those breakout groups for, I think we've got 8 minutes for the breakout groups. Great. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. So I've got
Brilliant.
if you've got your camera on, that would be brilliant.
Don't
Okay.
forget you're all on mute.
So hopefully you were able to have a look at those 3 questions. What is the second sight for your projects? What is invisible to you? And so what? So what we're going to do is look at each of those in turn, and hopefully you've nominated someone to be your typist, but any of you can type in the boxes. So can you please answer that first question? What did you identify as your second sight? You know, anything you identified as your second sight, please put it in the chat box. I'll be interested to see what you think counts as a second sight for you on your project. I can see some shoulders slightly moving, so I think people are typing. A box for others to work on after the project is completed. Okay, Carl, can you explain that, please? Just expand on what you mean by the box for others to work on after a project is completed.
I wasn't the note taker, but sometimes it's quicker to type. At least he took some notes in breakout session 1. But I looked at it from a point of view of there is lots of people because not lots of local tradesmen and ladies are there available to build this thing. So this thing's getting built. These people will disappear onto the next innovative project, and others, my second sight is for others to look after it.
Okay.
So rather than maybe the materials strain, but that's all linked to it, others will want to look after it. It'll enhance the local surroundings, and that local surrounding could be a few little villages. There might be, a workshop there that somebody can do something, or it might be the next big town. For the project I work on, I've got to be fairly sensitive, but it's leaving something, a legacy item, for a period of its life for others to look after, which enhances the area. So much, the argument being, if Gatwick wasn't there, what else is there for West Sussex, really?
So Ollie, maybe
anyway.
I can ask your reflections or observations.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think we recognize that the building of a building is only a moment in its life and its impact on other people. So we might expect lots of people to work in it, lots of people to live in it, and at some point some people's going to dismantle it as well, which is what we're increasingly thinking about now. I think what's interesting is about how do we bring forward this is what the Welsh government is trying to do with its Future Generations Act, thinking about after you've built something, what is the impact on this structure for not just this generation, but the future one and the future ones in that place and in the wider sphere? Because people move on, designers move on, but the building stays and its impacts stays as well. So that's
cool.
That's my response.
Thank you. And Ray, I see you've spoken about all suppliers, but how as designers it's difficult to identify what that means. So Ray, maybe I can ask you to just talk about your experience of that and the so what from that observation.
Yeah, so really what we're talking about was, well, if we have our site, but then everything that comes onto that site comes from somewhere, and someone has to supply that. So how do we compare those products, and how do we identify the best product for that particular use that that has the most benefit for people and the environment and that kind of stuff. So one of the things I brought up was the environmental product declarations as a possible way to compare products of a similar ilk, and they're not the easiest things to read, but at least there's a method to compare products. And then one of the points that one of the guys mentioned then was, okay, well, one of the guys mentioned, well, if things are actually being built, they can't actually order a product enough from part of China because there's some kind of an issue with the slavery issues and where it's being built. So that's what's invisible. So what are we actually ordering? Where does that come from? How is that being made? We don't see that. How do we compare those products? I don't know. So it's the more we think about it, the more of an issue it is for designers. But I don't think we have all the information to do that, or maybe someone can challenge me at that point. But I suppose we have to make the best decision with the information we have.
That's interesting. So what I'm going to do is that leads us on to our second question, which is what is invisible to you? And so maybe I can ask you to type in the box the answer to that question. And whilst you're typing, I'll come back to Ollie and maybe you can reflect on what Ray was just talking about. But those of you who are thinking about what's invisible to you, maybe you can start typing that in the box now. And Ollie, I'll come back to you.
Great, thanks, Nick. Thanks, Ray, for that question and that point. It's like that. Yes, there is a shortage of information. There's a shortage of information. What I'd say as a comparison is that as an industry, we have just massively increased our information around a topic, which is carbon. 10 years ago, it might have been ridiculous to have expected that we have managed to have that much information about carbon. And now it is something that is pretty easy to get hold of. And the process of doing decarbonisation and carbon assessments is actually much easier. And it's really interesting how that's developed. That's actually developed through industry-wide collaboration. People came forward. Organizations didn't say, we're going to keep this to ourselves, we're not going to tell anyone. Actually, organizations said, we're going to do a upfront mea culpa, this is our impact. And they started sharing all that data. We've seen that in GIRI, where people started sharing data around error. That's actually how the original research was done for GIRI. I think that we can start to share information about our wider impact collectively. There's no point in competing on this stuff. We can find ways to make sense of it. Two projects I'll mention very quickly. UK Green Building Council and then separately Expedition Engineering are both doing research into something that they're called embodied biodiversity. So equivalent to embodied carbon for your buildings. What about embodied biological impact? Actually, never mind putting beehives on the top of your building on a green roof if along the way you've killed 1,000, 10,000 bees along the way. It's no point in doing it just here on the site if along the way we've created a wake of destruction. So they're doing that work, but it's into the public realm so that actually we can share this stuff. So there you go.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll just ask the final wrap-up question now, which is that we've identified that this is sort of blowing open an awareness that maybe hasn't been typical. But what is the so what that we can take away from this? As designers, being more aware of the breadth of our impact, so what? What should we do now? What do you think are the key takeaways for designers as we become aware of the needs of regenerative practice? So I'll let you put some thoughts in the box. And I just want to hear anything that you think we should be doing now. Any big so what deductions from that? Okay, so Carl, you've identified batteries. Sounds like we've got a rabbit hole of talking about electric cars that we're about to dive down here. So, yeah. Well,
I think it's also sorry to cut across you, Carl. So very quickly, it's a question. That's a question of unintended consequences. So we go this silver bullet over here, then causes another problem. Well, there's no such thing as a silver bullet. So yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks. Okay, we've got from Russell, challenge clients to define their aspirations and understand the potential cost and impact of different solutions. Russell, can I ask you just to expand on that? Because this is, a very interesting idea, isn't it? Of what is the role of the client? What is the role of the designer? What's the design? Everyone different roles. So maybe you can expand on that.
Yeah, it's something we discussed in our team just now. Essentially, designers are kind of limited in quite often in what they can pose as solutions by the sort of nature of what, it might be a performance or a spec, and further down the line it's somebody with the purse strings that basically just says, no, we're not having that, we'll have this because that's all we can afford. But the client may have an initial aspiration that they're expecting something, but they don't really understand how much that will cost. So I think potentially designers have a duty to challenge that at the beginning, understand what the client wants. Even it's just asking those questions, a few whys, what do you want to get out of this and why? And do you understand, if you want that, then there are potential costs, efforts, you know, different requirements to achieve that, and what that actually entails, and just getting that defined at the beginning of the brief, because it very rarely is actually articulated properly.
Fascinating. Ollie, I'll give you the final word before we hand back to Cliff to wrap up, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Russell, for that point. I mean, client driver for this is obviously really important, and we've only touched on this sort of side of it, which is looking at our footprint, not just our carbon footprint, the footprint of everything else towards our project. But there might be other drivers for this the clients might be interested in. Nick showed some right at the start. There's a changing political climate around the impact of construction, what we want to be doing. There might be changing legislation. There might be changing consumer drivers. So, for example, in student housing, students becoming increasingly concerned and discerning about what are the buildings they were going to want to be working in. And there's a resilience thing. We saw what happened when a ship parked itself sideways in the Suez Canal, and our global supply chains, just in a matter of weeks, took a massive hit. We see it with the war in Ukraine. Our global supply chains are potentially causing us problems in future. How can we actually start to understand these better, build a more resilient construction industry, which hopefully through building stuff is making things better, not just where we're building, but in all the other places that we're touching along the way.
Thank you. Okay, I will hand back to you, Cliff, as we are approaching our 1 hour time limit. Hand back to you. Oh, you're muted, Cliff. Still muted.
So that's my 30 seconds I get at the end, is it, Nick? I think what comes to my mind from all the queries and the comments and what you've been saying is this issue about what's your physical boundary and what's your time limit, which you opened with, because it's almost limitless, isn't it? I mean, you can affect, when I say limitless, within a global limit. I think have you come across the 6 degrees of separation, which is apparently you're 6 degrees separation from everybody in the world. If you, from the people you know and who they know and who knows, you're only 6 degrees and you know everybody. And I think the impact on all these issues on material resources and waste and this carbon, the carbon initiatives we have that impact all the way around the world. And you as individuals can do your bit by what you do at work each day to try and affect the answers. So I think, and designers have a particular role in the construction industry, and that relationship between clients and designers at the early briefing stages is absolutely crucial. We touch on that obviously in the GIRI design guide, but you know, that apart, I see these 3 webinars that we've done as particularly emphasizing how important GIRI sees the relationship between client and designer and how we're trying to help the culture of that relationship so that we're not driving lowest cost for everything. We're trying to get the best value result. So thanks, Nick. Thanks for your input for the last 3. Thanks, Oliver, for today. And thank you everyone who's come along and for your wise words. And we'll see you soon.